For more than 70 years, the world believed Korea was divided: two nations, two systems, two completely different futures. North Korea and South Korea stood on opposite sides of history, different lifestyles, different economies, different ways of seeing the world. But then something changed. Scientists began comparing DNA samples from both sides of the Korean border. What they found shocked everyone. The differences were almost impossible to notice after decades of separation. Bloodlines still looked nearly identical. One people separated by politics, not by ancestry. And that raised a strange question. If the people never truly changed, then what exactly did the border divide? The Korean border is one of the most restricted places on Earth. A narrow strip of land crossing forests and mountains, tall fences, guard posts, silent empty roads. On one side stands North Korea, a country hidden from much of the outside world. On the other side stands South Korea, modern, connected, fast-moving. For decades, the world viewed them as complete opposites. One developed in isolation, the other became global, one stayed closed. The other opened to the world. Everything about them seemed different. Even their stories changed. School lessons changed. National identity changed. Entire generations grew up believing they were no longer the same people. But the deeper race science looked, stranger the story became, because DNA remembers older things. Older than governments. Older than modern borders. Older than political systems. And when researchers finally began studying Korean genetic history closely, they discovered traces of a shared ancestry stretching back thousands of years. The separation suddenly looked temporary, almost unnatural. No one expected what came next. Ancient migration studies revealed something surprising. For centuries, Korea remained unusually connected genetically. Dynasties changed. Outside influences arrived, history moved forward, but the population stayed remarkably similar. Few regions on Earth showed this level of continuity, and that raised another question. If Korea stayed genetically connected for thousands of years, what happens when a nation gets separated almost overnight? Could decades of isolation slowly change identity? Could culture reshape biology? Or would the original connection survive beneath everything else? Scientists wanted answers, so they turned to DNA databases, family records, ancient remains, samples from Korean communities around the world. And buried inside those studies, they found clues nobody expected. Long before the modern border existed, Korea was already one of the most culturally unified regions in East Asia. Families shared language, traditions, food, stories. Entire generations lived without imagining a divided peninsula. Villages stayed connected for centuries. Trade routes crossed mountains and rivers. People moved slowly between regions. And over time, their DNA mixed again and again. Researchers studying ancient Korean remains noticed something unusual: genetic continuity. The same markers appearing across centuries, the same ancestral patterns surviving through changing eras. This is where the story gets strange. Most regions experience major population shifts over time. Empires expand, communities move, outside groups settle permanently, but Korea showed fewer dramatic changes than many neighboring regions. The population remained surprisingly stable. One study compared ancient remains with modern Korean DNA samples. The overlap was remarkable, thousands of years apart, yet still deeply connected. That discovery shocked many researchers, because it suggested something powerful. Modern Koreans were carrying an unusually preserved ancestral signature, and that signature appeared on both sides of the border, north and south. Still connected beneath everything else, but then something changed. Researchers began looking beyond general ancestry. They started examining smaller genetic patterns, regional traits, inherited markers. Tiny variations inside family lines. At first, the differences looked minor, almost meaningless, but one detail kept appearing. People from separated Korean families often shared stronger similarities than expected, even after decades apart. Even after completely different lifestyles, the DNA connection remained unusually strong. One researcher quietly admitted something surprising. The border changed daily life faster than it changed ancestry. That single sentence changed the direction of the investigation. Because suddenly, division between North and South looked newer than people imagined, almost temporary. Scientists expected separation to slowly create noticeable differences. But many markers remained nearly unchanged, and that confused researchers. How could decades of isolation leave so little genetic impact? Why did the connection remain so visible? Some experts believed the separation simply wasn't old enough. Others argued Korean genetic history was already too unified to divide quickly, but not everyone agreed. A few researchers noticed subtle patterns beginning to appear, small regional shifts, minor inherited differences, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise questions. What happens if separation continues for another 100 years? Would the two populations eventually drift apart, genetically? Would future generations slowly become distinguishable? And if that happened, what would it mean for identity itself? The deeper scientists looked, more complicated the answers became, because biology was telling one story, politics was telling another. And somewhere between them sat the truth. Then came one of the most emotional discoveries of all: family reunion programs. Relatives separated for decades were briefly allowed to meet again. Brothers meeting brothers, parents meeting children, grandparents seeing faces they thought were gone forever. Many arrived as strangers, but something unexpected kept happening. People recognized familiar features immediately. Eyes, smiles, prefectures, tiny inherited habits. Some cried before speaking a single word. No one expected what came next. Researchers observing these reunions noticed how powerfully ancestry survived separation. Not only culturally, physically, the similarities remained visible even after generations apart. And for many scientists, that became impossible to ignore. The border had changed governments, it had changed lifestyles, but the people themselves still carried the same deep roots. And that created a difficult question. If the ancestry remained connected, could the division ever truly become permanent? That question quietly followed researchers for years. Then another study appeared. This one focused on broader East Asian genetic comparisons. The goal seemed simple: measured how Korean populations compared with neighboring countries, but the results created another mystery. North and South Koreans clustered extremely close together genetically, closer than many expected, closer than some regional populations living inside the same country elsewhere in the world. Again and again, data pointed to the same conclusion: the separation was political, not ancestral. But then researchers uncovered one final detail, a detail that changed everything. A small group of scientists began studying isolated communities near remote northern regions, communities with limited outside movement for decades. Researchers expected stronger divergence there. Finally, they thought measurable differences might appear. Instead, ancestral markers still aligned closely with southern populations. What they found shocked everyone. Even under long separation, original genetic connection remained deeply preserved, one bloodline, still visible beneath modern history. And suddenly, the biggest question was no longer whether North and South were different. The real question became something far stranger. How long can a border divide people before the people stop believing they were ever connected at all? Everything pointed toward one answer: one shared ancestry, one preserved bloodline, one history stretching back thousands of years. But there was one thing researchers still couldn't fully explain: one missing piece, one unanswered detail hidden beneath all the data. because DNA showed connection, but identity is more complicated than DNA, and somewhere inside that difference sat the real mystery. A mystery researchers are still trying to understand today. That mystery, for decades, the world looked at Korea and saw separation, different flags, different systems, different futures, but beneath the surface, the story never became that simple. Scientists expected distance to slowly reshape the population. They expected isolation to leave visible genetic marks. Instead, deeper they looked, the more connected everything appeared. One bloodline, still surviving beneath politics, borders, and time itself. But then something changed. Researchers stopped asking whether North and South Koreans were genetically related. That answer already seemed clear. Now they asked something much stranger. If the ancestry remained connected, why did the emotional divide feel so deep? And that question led scientists into territory far beyond genetics. The investigation expanded. Anthropologists joined the research. Historians joined, linguists, demographers, even psychologists, because the mystery was no longer about biology alone. It was about identity. Researchers began studying old Korean census records, family books passed through generations, ancient migration paths, buried historical documents. The goal was simple: find the moment the division truly began. And what they discovered surprised many experts. For most of Korean history, regional identity mattered less than shared heritage. Northern families and southern families traded freely. Marriage connections stretched across the peninsula. Cultural traditions overlapped almost everywhere. Even dialect differences remained relatively small compared to many other countries. This is where the story gets strange. The modern image of two completely separate Koreas is actually very recent. Extremely recent from a genetic perspective, almost instantaneous. Thousands of years of shared ancestry existed before the division appeared, and DNA still reflected that older history. One researcher explained it quietly: genies remember older borders than maps do. That single sentence changed how many people viewed the peninsula. Because suddenly, border looked temporary against the scale of ancestry. But then, another discovery complicated everything. Scientists studying epigenetics began noticing subtle environmental differences. Not changes in ancestry, changes in expression, nutrition, stress levels, lifestyle conditions. These factors can influence how genes behave over time. The DNA sequence itself remained remarkably similar. Yes, but the environments surrounding people had changed dramatically, and those changes slowly leave biological traces. Researchers noticed slight differences in height averages, metabolism patterns. Certain health indicators, nothing extreme, but enough to show that separation still affects the body, not by rewriting ancestry, but by reshaping daily life around it. No one expected what came next. A team studying Korean communities overseas compared their DNA with both North and South Koreans. The expectation seemed obvious. Decades abroad would likely create more variation. But again, core ancestry remained deeply recognizable. Whether families moved to China, Japan, the United States, or Central Asia, genetic continuity remained unusually strong. That consistency fascinated researchers because few populations maintained such visible ancestry across so ancestral connection, across so much time and movement, and that raised another uncomfortable question. If the biological connection remained so stable, why did the political separation feel permanent? Some experts believed the answer had nothing to do with genetics, it had to do with memory. Generations raised apart begin building different emotional worlds, different fears, different hopes, different versions of history, and over time, those stories can feel stronger than ancestry itself. Researchers interviewing separated families noticed something heartbreaking. Many older relatives still describe themselves simply as Korean, not Northern, not Southern, just Korean. But younger generations often identified differently. The separation had become normal to them. Expected, permanent. That shift deeply affected historians, because it revealed something DNA could never measure. Identity changes faster than ancestry, and that realization transformed the entire investigation. Scientists were no longer studying a divided population. They were studying how humans understand belonging itself. Then came one of the most important studies of all. A multinational research team mapped Korean genetic patterns against neighboring East Asian populations in extreme detail, thousands of samples, complex ancestry modeling, migration simulations. Years of analysis, the results became impossible to ignore. North and South Koreans consistently clustered together with remarkable closeness, closer than many regional populations elsewhere. Again and again, evidence pointed toward one conclusion: the division happened too recently to erase thousands of years of shared ancestry. But there was one detail hidden deep inside the data. A detail few people noticed at first: small regional differences inside Korea already existed long before modern separation. Tiny patterns connected to geography, mountain regions, coastal regions. Northern climates, southern climates, these differences were subtle, natural, ancient, and researchers realized something important. The border did not create entirely new identities overnight. Instead, froze existing regional differences and slowly amplified them through isolation. That discovery changed everything, because suddenly the story became more human. Not two completely different peoples, not identical copies either, but one deeply connected population slowly moving through different experiences. And that question has never been fully answered. How much separation does it take before people stop seeing each other as one family? The biggest reveal came quietly. No dramatic announcement, no global headlines, just a growing scientific consensus. Korean ancestry remains overwhelmingly shared. The bloodline stayed connected far longer than politics suggested. That was the truth hidden beneath decades of division. And once researchers understood that, another realization followed immediately: borders can separate systems. They can separate economies. They can even separate memories. But separating ancestry is much harder, especially in such a short time. For many Koreans, this discovery carried enormous emotional weight. Because somewhere across the border, millions of people still carry the same ancestral story, the same deep origins, the same ancient roots stretching back through centuries. Some families still keep faded photographs, old letters, maps of villages they cannot visit anymore, stories passed quietly between generations. Not stories about politics, stories about home. One elderly woman interviewed during a reunion program said something simple: "When I saw my brother smile, I forgot the border existed." Just one sentence, but it stayed with researchers for years. Because it captured something the DNA studies kept revealing again and again: conch survives longer than separation, even after decades apart, even after history changes around it. But the story doesn't end neatly, because biology alone cannot reunite people. Shared ancestry cannot erase decades of distance overnight, and researchers understand that better than anyone. DNA can show where people came from. It cannot decide where they go next. Still, findings changed how many experts viewed the Korean Peninsula forever, not as two unrelated populations, but as one long human story interrupted by modern history, a story still unfolding today. And somewhere inside laboratories, archives, and family records, scientists continue searching for answers. Not answers about politics, and wonders about people, about memory, about identity, about how long ancient connections survive beneath modern divisions. The border remains, the systems remain. The separation remains, but beneath all of it, bloodline still remembers. And somewhere tonight, on opposite sides of that silent border, two families carrying the same ancestry are looking at the same moon, without ever meeting, without ever knowing. Still connected by something older than history itself. The governments changed, the world changed, the generations changed. But the deeper story never fully disappeared. And somewhere, right now, inside an old family record, or a forgotten DNA sample, or a photograph waiting in silence, last missing piece still exists. We just haven't found it yet.